So he took him by the hand again and led him into a very dark room where a man in an iron cage sat. Now this man seemed very sad. He sat with his eyes looking down to the ground, his hands folded together, and he sighed as if his heart were breaking. Christian asked, "What does this mean?" The interpreter then told Christian to ask the man himself. So Christian said to the man, "What are you?" The man answered, "I am now what I once was not." Christian responded, "What were you once?" The man said, "I was once an honest and flourishing professor of faith, both in my own eyes and also in the eyes of others. I once was, as I thought, headed for the celestial city and had joy at the thought that I would get there." Christian further questioned, "Well, what are you now?" The man responded, "I am now a man of despair, and am locked up in despair as in this iron cage. I cannot get out. Oh, I cannot escape. I have so hardened my heart that I cannot repent." He goes on to say that it was the allures and profits and riches of the world that led him there. He chased after the wind and reaped the whirlwind. There were no locks on his cage. It was a prison of his own doing. In 1678, the timeless allegory Pilgrim's Progress was published. The aforementioned story is found in its pages. Ironically, John Bunyan wrote this masterpiece from prison. Cited as the first novel ever written in English, translated into more than 200 languages, it's regarded as one of the most significant works of theological fiction. An unending well of creativity and purpose are discovered within ourselves when we encounter silence. When we remove distraction, our thinking and purpose becomes apparent and pathways unfold. Blaise Pascal said, "Distraction is the only thing that consoles us for miseries, and yet it is itself the greatest of our miseries." Stay tuned to hear the story of one such man who has removed the toxicity of distraction and embraced a life of freedom, intention, and significance that's impacting countless lives. You won't want to miss this on today's episode of the 6-8 Culture podcast. Welcome to the 6-8 Culture Podcast, an international community where we share stories of transformation and restoration from the inside out, based on justice, kindness, and humility. Come journey with us. I'm your host, Rob McKinley. Today's guest describes himself as a 9 hours a night, unminimalist, anti-political, ambiverted, ENTJ, Enneagram 8. He's an author, director, producer, filmmaker, and sojourner of creating space to help shine light into the darkest and most challenging areas of humanity. A few of his highlights: he owns no cell phone. He's produced 4 films that have played on TV in 12 countries. He's traveled to 40 countries, including North Korea, dined with the Pope, and had his books endorsed by presidents and prime ministers. He doesn't vote, but has testified in committee to help change 2 laws. He has no Netflix, Spotify, Instagram, or Facebook newsfeed, and experiences no internet ads, including YouTube commercials. His writing has appeared in Time Magazine, Esquire, Christianity Today, Relevant Magazine, the Huffington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, Writer's Digest, and The Guardian. A summary of his journey can be found on his engaging Meaning Over Money talk, found on This Is Me TV on YouTube. It's not only an honor, but truly significant to have him join us today, as his life is conducted as one that champions justice, kindness, and humility. Jared Brock, a real pleasure to welcome you to the 6-8 Culture Podcast.
Wow, Rob, what an introduction. I listened to, you did your research first of all, but I just listened to that. I was like, wow, what a weirdo. Who are you interviewing today? So embarrassing.
I really did creep you out. And it's just fascinating to see this journey that you've been on, Jared. Just great that you can join us. You know, we've intersected through some mutual friends, but what prompted me to reach out to you was a recent article that you had written on medium.com. We'll be touching on that a little bit later, but I really want to find out who this guy, Jared Brock, is. Risen from obscurity to author, producer, director. What's really captivated me is how you shed light on a variety of global injustices through the written word, film, and other media. Where did you come from, and what awoke this passion in you?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm out of obscurity, nor do I want to be. The one thing my wife and I are really trying to figure out right now is how can we have influence without fame? We live in a culture where everyone is just desperately trying to become insta-famous, and whether it's through TikTok or Snapchat or YouTube star or whatever it is, we're really trying to figure out how can we be influential without having our face plastered everywhere, where somehow the glory can still all go to God, but yet we can help be part of guiding a conversation. I have not figured that one out yet. Yeah, I was born and raised in Guelph, Ontario, in Canada, about 3,000 miles from you on the west coast there.
Right.
I grew up in a Christian home. My dad is a church planter. My mom is a life coach. She's currently working on her first book. I just had a pretty standard upbringing. Definitely rejected faith as a young man, but eventually got saved at 17. Sometimes I feel like Christian kids are inoculated against faith, right? They have so many little jabs, little hits of Christianity, or at least moralism, but they miss the whole lordship of Jesus. And so I had to eventually let him take control and kind of set me on a whole different journey.
So Jared, you had a goal of becoming a millionaire by the time you were 30. So how did that work out? And what happened? A collision of perspective between the temporal and eternal? I got a little bit of a window into this on one of your documentaries. Can you share on that?
Yeah, what an embarrassing goal to have as a young man, eh? Actually, it's a multi-generational problem, perhaps. So my dad's goal was to become a millionaire by the time he was 30. But in his 20s, God really gripped his heart, changed his trajectory, and he ended up becoming a pastor. And as you know, unless you're an American televangelist, you don't make millions. And as a young man, I looked at that and I said, my dad has failed. And I will become a millionaire by the time I'm 30 because he didn't. Thankfully, my young bride just always had this sense that God gripped Jared's dad's heart. He will do the same for my husband. And a couple years into our marriage, we backpacked through Central America. We got one-way tickets and went from the Panama Canal all the way to Mexico, through all the countries over 5 months, volunteering at eco resorts and hippie villages and intentional communities. And when we were in Guatemala, we went down to see the lake. And it's one of the only places in the world that had freshwater sharks. And, you know, it's considered one of the natural wonders of the world. And we were very excited to see it. We walked down on this blazing hot day. The lake was covered in plastic Coke bottles as far as the eye could see. And we were so disappointed. And we started to walk back to the bus station. And we saw a 19-year-old guy with no legs, on crutches, roasted in the sun. He went to a fire hydrant and he sat down and he pulled out a straw and he started drinking from a rusty, dripping fire hydrant. And that just broke me. And we rushed into a convenience store and we bought 3 plastic bottles of water and juice. And we sat with him, and his name was Daniel. And who knows if he's even alive anymore, but it was a before and after moment in my life when all of a sudden I realized the real theology is not be good and God will bless you. It's we are blessed to be a blessing. And that was the moment where that goal went out the window. And it definitely was just a completely before and after moment in my life.
That's incredible. I think many of us, especially people who have traveled to more impoverished or global south countries, can attest to the power of that. Everything can turn around if you're receptive to it.
Yeah. You know, Rob, you're so right on that. I've had conversations with a couple of friends in the last year that I regularly need a hit of poverty in my life because I live in a nice little safe village. It's so wealthy by global standards. And I need to be reminded viscerally, physically of poverty on a regular basis. So my wife was born in Kenya and raised in Ethiopia as a missionary kid. Dad was with World Vision. And we went back a couple years ago. Michelle was working on a docuseries And we wanted to find her childhood home, and we wanted to find the fair trade coffee plantation where our local fair trade coffee shop in Canada got its coffee beans from. So it's kind of a 3-reason trip. So we did this trip and we got connected with a missionary there who works with the poorest of the poor in Addis Ababa, the capital. And they actually built their family home, this Western North American family. They built their home kind of on the edge of the ghetto, and their dining room window frames a view of a giant dump, one of the largest dumps in the world, hundreds of feet high, kilometers in area, and people crawling all over it, children, men, women of all ages, sorting through trash. I think a year ago there was actually a collapse, like a landslide of garbage, and killed a bunch of people. People are living in this dump, and they actually framed their living room view as a reminder, a constant reminder of this is why we're here. We are blessed to be a blessing to these people. I kind of need that window in my life on a regular basis.
Yeah, that is so powerful as a great reminder. I was in Ethiopia back in March, and what an amazing, beautiful culture of people. Mm-hmm. I had experienced joy and thankfulness and poverty in this convergence like I've never seen before, and I had learned so much. There's so many similarities in the manifestation of poverty as you travel globally, yes. Yet each one speaks so uniquely to you. And the joy and the gratitude that I see as a commonality within all of these countries that seems to largely be devoid in the West.
Yeah, it's interesting. We are obviously in the era of late stage capitalism. It's now savaged the planet, and we need to radically change the trajectory. There's currently 1 billion people globally living in slums. And within our lifetime, that number is going to rise to 3 billion people living in slums. So sure, we've had lots of great progress in the West. It's obviously come at the cost of overseas labor and exploitation of the planet. We've kind of reached an inflection point where we can't really collapse the ecosystem anymore. So now it's simply a matter of just leaning into people. And so I don't even know what we're going to do about 3 billion people living in slums. It's an unfathomable number, but I think the Christian church probably really needs to wake up and be leaders on this. There's so many issues we fight about, but there's still these massive things like creation care and people care, pretty much the biggest fundamentals that just no one's talking about.
Yeah, and I think largely the Christian church in the West, because you witness the Christian church in many global South countries, and they're at the forefront of tackling these things head on. You had mentioned your wife, Michelle, and I'd be remiss not to hear a little bit about her because she's in the credits for most of your documentaries that I've seen. And if you could just share a little bit about the part that she plays in the work that the two of you do together.
Yes. So my wife is from good Finnish stock. Her parents are from Finland. She's actually in the kind of Finnish purebred directory, as weird as that sounds. I've seen her name in the Blue Book. I had to ask her dad permission to marry her. Me and Ari butt naked in the sauna. For real. It's a very Finnish home, quite egalitarian. Michelle is very much her own woman, and she's amazing. I met her in the 7th grade. I kissed her in the summer of the 7th grade at a Newsboys concert, so you can be sure that it's true love. And we've been married for 12 and a half years now. Michelle's role when it comes to documentaries, she's really good at taking 50 interviews, 100 hours of footage, this giant ball of mixed up yarn, and she is great at untangling all the knots and figuring out the flow and the order and the logic leaps and just really getting it in order. She's definitely an editor at heart. She hates leading, but yet she's so good at it. She loves being a number 2. She is the Moses, but she wants to be the Aaron. She's the most likable and lovable person I've ever met. And I'm so glad I met her young because I'd have no chance if I met her today. Yes, she's phenomenal. She's a producer and an editor on all our films. But Michelle, during COVID, actually, her grandma died and they were unable to go to the funeral. So she randomly joined this hackathon online, and her team, which was, I think, in 6 different time zones, they ended up winning. And Michelle's app idea, it's called soundofyourlove.com. And basically a host can start an account. So let's say you, Rob, let's say your mom is dying in hospital and you can't see her, no one else can see her, everyone's locked down. You would just send out one number, everyone calls in, leave a message. You can then put them in the order you want, and then the nurse just has to do 1-click playback. And this has been helping people all over the world who are dying to die with dignity, with the sound of love in their ears. And there was one story this week of someone who died 9 minutes after hearing the goodbyes and love of their family. Just absolutely powerful. It's free and it's just by donation only. And so that's kind of her newest side project she's been working on. So I haven't seen her much this year, but
that's incredible. Can you say the name of the app again?
Yeah, it's soundofyourlove.com, and it's going to be a big thing.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. Now, both of you elected to earn the average salary of a Canadian citizen and give the rest away. Can you tell us a little bit how you arrived at that decision and how that played out?
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about family of origin. Maybe we just have money problems. I had a great grandma who was a multi-millionaire, and an uncle who was the same, but just really lived their lives for themselves and ended up pretty empty and alone by the end. So money and stewardship have always been kind of tricky subjects for me. One of my spiritual gifts is generosity. So really having to figure out how to steward that well. I was really inspired by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. You know, there's tens of millions of people in our faith family because of him and his brother and a couple of other preachers in the 1700s. And I've had the opportunity to tour his home in London, England, and stand in his prayer room. And Wesley, he basically made a decision as a young man to live on X. I think it was like 22 pounds at the time or some nonsense. And if he made more than that, he would just give it away. So the first year he made, I think he was 24. And so he gave away 2 and he lived on 22. And then the next year he made 30 and he gave away 8. And he continued that for the rest of his life. And in his lifetime, I did the math one time, he lived on 7% less than the average Londoner at the time, but he gave away the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars and sparked a movement that, you know, today there are 80 million Methodists. So
amazing.
300 years after he's gone, only one life it soon will pass, only what's done for Christ will last, as the poem goes. Yeah, just Wesley was just a big inspiration for me. And early in our marriage, I just said to Michelle, I want to be the kind of people that we don't increase our standard of living, we just increase our standard of giving. It's so irresponsible in this time and place to not do that.
That's amazing, because I don't think capitalism in itself is inherently evil, but unfettered capitalism is. And when you look at the practice of what you and your wife, Michelle, are doing on giving away everything past what the average Canadian salary would be, that's where we can look at really changing the world.
St. Augustine said something so great. He said, what can fulfill a man besides God himself? And the answer is everything. All the money, all the power, all the sex, all the food, all the experiences, everything. Only everything could satiate the human heart. So there is no amount of money that's ever going to do it for you. That's going to say, like, right, it's not the gospel.
Yeah.
And so we just have to just put a cap on it. We have to say, like, what is enough for me? What is enough? I've had the opportunity to meet so many interesting people, Rob, that have inspired this. Another one, just a really quick story. Have you ever heard of a man named Stanley Tam?
Sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah, so basically Stanley, he was a traveling salesman in Ohio in the 30s and the 40s, and he just wasn't doing well. And he pulled over his Model T to the side of the highway one day, and he just cried out to God. He just said, God, I'm going to shut down the business, go home, get a 9-to-5, grind it out like everyone else. And he felt really burdened about that. He really felt God say, well, then give me your business. So he went to his lawyer and he said, hey, I want to legally make God the owner of my business. So they set it up. So it's a for-profit company owned by a not-for-profit trust. He's the trustee. So he can set his own salary, but all the corporate profits have to go to charity legally. And since then, that plastics company in upstate Ohio has given over $120 million to world missions, and it's led over 5 million people to Christ. And I had the opportunity to meet him in his late 90s. I drove to Ohio and brought 2 large coffees and sat and just went into his office and was like, I got to talk to you, sir. We talked for about 2 hours, and he's got pictures of him and Billy Graham on the wall. It's just crazy. But
wow.
Yeah, what a guy. So, you know, stories like that, it's just like, that's so much more interesting than, oh, look, 2 more zeros in my bank account.
Right. Yeah, it's all about the relationship. Now, speaking about that, you had come out, I guess this last 10 years has been quite the journey for both of you. And in 2010, you were out here on Vancouver Island. What brought you out here?
Oh, a wonderful, wonderful author named Mark Buchanan. When I was 21, I had a very powerful moment in Chicago where I realized that I had the sense that my calling was to be a writer, to tell stories that lead people closer to God, and then to give away profits. That was kind of just the strong sense that I got. So I started on that journey, and Mark Buchanan, for those who don't know, is just a great author. You've had him on the podcast, I've heard, and he's the most technically gifted Christian writer alive today. And I've chatted with Anne Voskamp, one of the biggest Christian authors in the world, and even she agrees Mark is the best technically gifted Christian author. And so I Skyped him from a Costa Rican rainforest, and I said, hey, if I fly across the country and volunteer 20 hours a week at your church, would you give me 1 hour a week to go for a drink or a hike and just talk about writing and life and leadership? And so they ran it through the elders, and I was interviewed, and we made the plunge and got to spend 6 months on Van Island. And Mark has become a lifelong friend and mentor. And I eventually became an author, and I'm on that journey. He really got my writing career off the ground. He probably saved me 10 years.
Wow. Yeah. I can't say enough about that man as well. He has mentored many, many people, myself included. That's just a great story. By the way, where in Costa Rica were you writing that from?
We were volunteering at this eco resort called Rancho Margo. The founder of it had been the man who introduced Burger King to Europe, and I think he was paying his debt to the devil by starting an organic, sustainable eco village. It's actually nestled between 3 national rainforests, and it had its own microclimate. It was so lush, Rob, that we saw blue mushrooms that glowed in the dark. It was like Avatar, and they would build fences, and the fence posts would sprout back to life with flowers, just like Aaron's staff in the Old Testament, like so lush. And it was in the shadow of the Arenal volcano. So every night you just see the lava flowing down and the howler monkeys. And just one of those seasons. We spent a month volunteering there.
Was that up in Monteverde?
No, not quite that far. Yeah, if you Google Arenal later, it's a stunning place. You can go swimming in hot rivers that are warmed by volcanic eruptions. It's quite fantastic.
Yeah, I actually got some brutal saddle sores riding a horse up the Arenal there. And I got stung by a scorpion down in Costa Rica. But other than those two things, it was a phenomenal time. A third of that country is protected land. It's absolutely diverse and beautiful down there.
Yeah, they're doing a good job on the eco front for sure. One of the few countries in the world that's actually taking their stewardship responsibilities seriously.
Yeah. So on that, you wrote a book called The Year of Living Prayerfully. You embark on a 37,000-mile pilgrimage around the world where you met with Pope Francis, you walked on hot coals, you visited the country of North Korea and explored different prayer traditions. It would be great if you could touch on a couple of countries and experiences that really impacted you as you wrote that in this book.
Yeah, I think for people who aren't familiar with my work, the backstory to that is we were shooting a documentary on human trafficking called Red Light, Green Light. And we were in the red light districts of Amsterdam, and it was our first night there. We kind of went down to scope it out before filming. And I was outside of this one bar. There was about 300 drunk men just like cheering, screaming at some soccer game. There's police on horseback. There's people, peeing in the alleyways and whatnot. And it was just like crazy. And, after the games are over, if their team wins, they go and they celebrate with the girls. And if their team loses, they take their aggression on the girls. So either way, the girls lose. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of De Wallen, the red light district, is the oldest building in Amsterdam. It's a 800-year-old church. The church bell started ringing, and I just had this realization that men abuse women to the soundtrack of church bells. And I was just like overwhelmed, and I was like, God, I need your power and prayer to end this. So that's what really got me thinking a lot more about prayer. Again, growing up in a Christian home, you pray at mealtimes and bedtimes, but you don't have that constant communion with Christ, and you don't have that seeing God as dad, as father. And so yeah, it took me on a journey. We went to a whole bunch of countries. I went to Mount Athos, kind of the Mecca of Greek Orthodoxy, all dudes, holy island, no women allowed for over 1,000 years, including female animals. The whole place needed a woman's touch.
We're listening to filmmaker and author Jared Brock. Stay tuned as we hear more on his travels, stories, films, and practical insights on emancipating ourselves from the grips of social media.
North Korea was certainly the most heartbreaking place I've ever been. Wonderful people and massively brainwashed.
Yeah.
The whole country, it shouldn't be called a country. It should be called a slave state. Let's call it what it is. It is a mafia state run by the Kim family, and it has 24 million slaves, the Korean people. You live where they tell you to live. You work where they tell you to work. They're an inch shorter than their South Korean brothers and sisters because of malnourishment. Over 1 million people have starved to death in the last 30 years. And it's a place that believes what people throughout history have believed, and that's that we are the masters of our fate and the captains of our soul, that we are God. It's called the Juche idea. They have a tower to it. I got to go up this tower to their national belief. And it's ruining them. It's so sad because they're stuck in a proxy war with Russia, China, and America, and it seems intractable. So I wanted to go there, not to evangelize or smuggle in Bibles or anything. I just wanted to bear witness and pray. Instead of bowing before the dead emperor's body, which is in a glass coffin, instead of bowing, I refused to bow, and I just whispered the Lord's Prayer in the heart of North Korea. God's going to do what he's going to do, and people are going to stop it at all costs, but we know he wins in the end. Yeah, definitely keep North Korea in your prayers. It's a sad place, but I think of it very fondly.
Yeah, I've seen numerous documentaries on North Korea. I've studied about it for decades. Essentially, they believe Kim Il-sung created the dawn of time, and he's highly deified. Mm-hmm. You would have had somebody accompany you. Is that 24 hours a day everywhere you go?
Well, as soon as we landed, they took away my passport for quote unquote safekeeping. I was assigned a guide who, if I was at the urinal, he'd either use the urinal beside me or he would wash his hands. And the only time we were left alone was in our hotel rooms at night. But the hallways, of course, had video cameras on them, and the hotel was on an island. So it's not like we could go anywhere, nor would I have tried. The same hotel I stayed at a couple months after I left, that was where the American snuck onto the forbidden floor and was later lobotomized. They took out most of his brain and returned him home, and he died a couple weeks later.
Right.
That was the same hotel, Yanggakdo.
Wow.
I wasn't there to mess around. I really wasn't.
Now, you had previously mentioned when we were discussing your book, The Year of Living Prayerfully, that you were doing a documentary called Red Light, Green Light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one took us to 10 countries. At the time, the Supreme Court in Canada had struck down the laws on prostitution, and they gave Parliament 1 year to rewrite the laws. And there was a small but very loud group of people saying that we should just fully decriminalize prostitution, that anyone can rent a woman or a man's body. And we thought that maybe that was a terrible idea if you're serious about decreasing trafficking, because it's just demand-based economics. If there's more people who are willing to pay for a product, more people will supply it. So we went to 10 countries to look at different prostitution models. And the one that is the most compelling to me is an end-demand approach, where you make it illegal to purchase sex, because if no one's paying for sex, no one will be trafficked for sex. But at the same time, you make it fully legal for a woman to sell her body if she's in desperate need. She should not be criminalized. It's similar to if someone is being beaten up by their husband, you should arrest the man, not the woman, right? If someone is desperate and they need a loan, it should be fully legal to get a high interest loan, but it should be illegal to loan shark. So it's an asymmetric law. We already have precedents for it. So we made a film about that, about the end demand approach, about helping women get out if they want to get out, about supporting them with all the services they need, protecting them as much as possible, and then trying to end demand at the same time. I think we did a 100-city tour with that one and did a big petition drive. We have some good friends in Parliament who then got a law passed. And yes, that was Red Light, Green Light. It was
amazing.
Yeah.
God bless you on that, man. The incredible power of saying yes and walking into something within your passion. Now, similarly, you also did a film called Over 18, a documentary about porn. Now, this is a must watch, I believe, for anyone and everyone, male and female. I had done a paper in seminary about this subject back in 2008. And when I was researching it, the statistics were absolutely mind-boggling. Now, your film starts with a 13-year-old recovering porn addict whose compulsion began at age 9. Can you just highlight some of this film and the impact that pornography is having on society as a whole?
Yeah, so how we got into making a film on pornography was when we were making Red Light, Green Light, we had some cops tell us that when they raid these brothels, they often find video camera equipment, that these traffickers are making pornography of these trafficked women. And they're either posting it online, selling it, or more often than not, they're using it as a threat. If you ever leave or try to run away, we'll send this to your family, we'll post this on the internet, whatever the case may be. And then the other thing is, women in the red light districts have reported that men come into brothels with porn on their cell phones and say, I want to do this. So there's kind of a push factor there of giving men ideas. So we did this documentary on pornography. I saw pornography for the first time when I was 10 years old. I was babysitting, the kid was asleep. I was watching the NBA All-Star game, and it was stormy, and lightning hit a cable box somewhere, because all of a sudden it just like, boom, I was watching the Playboy channel, and they didn't have the Playboy channel. And I watched for about 10 minutes, and then it switched back to the game, and I didn't see porn again until I was 18 or 19 and I had moved out. But by the time that happened, my cerebral cortex was starting to form, my forward-thinking protective mechanism. Kids today, the average boy sees porn at 11, and it's a straight dopamine hit to your nucleus accumbens. It's the same strength as a hit of morphine. So imagine just getting a shot of morphine to your brain at age 11 and getting that day after day after day for a decade before you have any physical ability to protect yourself. And so it's leading to rampant addiction. It's leading to porn-induced erectile dysfunction. It's leading to the pornification of culture where guys are requesting brutal and violent acts with their sexual partners at a young age. It's just a lot of harms. So basically over 18, we argued that are you over 18, click yes or no button is not enough to protect a child. We need to have meaningful age verification. You know, in Canada, you can't gamble online without putting in a credit card. You can't get a driver's license without showing a birth certificate or a passport or whatever. Like, you have to prove your age. And we just want that in Canada. The world's biggest porn company is actually Canadian. It's called MindGeek, based out of Montreal. And they've actually invented meaningful age verification, and they use it in the countries that make them use it. And so we would really love to see Canada, the UK, America, countries all over the world pay a porn company to protect children from porn. It's anonymous, it's safe, it's private. You know, any adult can look at whatever they want to look at and suffer the consequences, but no one under 18, we think, would be a wise start in making a dent in this pornified culture.
The great thing about documentaries is that they can be both informative and transformative. Transformation occurs when the darkest reaches of humanity retreat to the light of a little-known historical figure named Josiah Henson. Our guest Jared Brock is redeeming this unjust obscurity for access to the masses. Let's listen as he shares this integral yet shrouded story and piece of history. One of your documentaries is entitled Redeeming Uncle Tom, the Josiah Henson story. I recently watched that. It's a groundbreaking documentary that restores a hero of the abolitionist movement to his rightful place in history. And as I was watching it, I'm thinking, oh, there's revisionist history and then there's redemptive fact-based history that transcends the zeitgeist of the era. So this falls into the latter and restores accreditation to its proper place. Why did you choose this particular person and piece of history?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, my career is a little bit all over the map. I chase the muse and follow what's interesting to me. I think if there's one thing that kind of unifies all my work, it's obviously my faith, but also just an exposure of corruption and a vision for a better world. Obviously way too broad, which is why I'm not a hugely famous author, because I can't stay focused enough. But yeah, for this project, the documentary is called Redeeming Uncle Tom, and the book is called The Road to Dawn. My wife had been wanting to read Uncle Tom's Cabin for a long time. It was the best-selling novel of the 19th century, the novel that Abraham Lincoln jokingly said started the Civil War. So kind of a big deal. So I bought it for her for Christmas, stuffed it in her stocking. She read it, loved it. I did a little bit more research and learned that it was inspired by a real man, a Christian minister who escaped from slavery, lived in Canada for 50 years, and his name was Josiah Henson. And I was like, oh, time out. How come I've never heard of this guy? So we visited his cabin in Ontario, 2 hours from our house. This guy was incredible. He won a medal at the First World's Fair in London. He was entertained at Windsor Castle in the White House. He rescued 118 enslaved people. He started all sorts of businesses and fundraised for the abolitionist cause. He had a meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was one of his supporters, just on and on and on. And all this after enduring 41 years of brutal slavery, watching his dad get whipped to the whites of his spine, having his own shoulders shattered by a fence pole so he could never raise his hands above his head. And yet he lands on Canadian soil. He makes a promise to the man who paid to send him across that he would use his freedom well. And Josiah's life is definitely a story of stewarding freedom well. There's a verse in the Bible that says, it was for freedom that Christ has set us free. And it's that whole blessed to be a blessing thing all over again. Josiah really kind of paid it forward and paid it back in a big way. So I was so inspired by this. So I ended up retracing his journey, 3,000 miles from slavery to freedom. I got to visit every place associated with him, including 2 plantations that are still in private hands, one of which that is still owned by his slave owners' descendants to this very day. Very, very strange place to be. But now I'm working on adapting my book as a limited series, and hopefully we can get that sold at some point and get the world knowing who Josiah Henson is. He deserves to be back in the echelon with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Solomon Northup and Yeah,
Absolutely.
hopefully we can get him there. Yeah.
It's great. It was such a powerful story, an incredible man, incredible life. So speaking of men often find it difficult to slow down and rest and reflect from the weight and obligations and distractions of the world. So as I alluded to earlier from Blaise Pascal, we often hide our miseries in the consolation of distraction, though distraction in itself is our greatest misery. So your book, Bearded Gospel Men, is a devotional that men may actually read. 31 epic bearded dudes who lived their faith in unbelievable ways. Can you share a couple of your favorite examples in this book?
Yeah. So how I came to this project was we were on tour with one of our films, and I met this incredible man named Aaron Alford. He was running this blog called Bearded Gospel Men. He had a 13-inch beard, and at the time he was working in a very, very dangerous city in California with prostituted women and drug addicts on the street. He has since taken a vow of celibacy, and he is training to become a priest in the poorest diocese in America. So this guy's like the real deal. And I said, hey, I love your blog. This is such a great idea. Do you want to co-author a book together? So we did. I guess one of the stories that I love from Bearded Gospel Men is a guy named Charles Monroe Sheldon. Sheldon, he lived in Topeka, Kansas, and he was a pastor, and he was trying to figure out how to get young people to come to their evening service. So he decided to write a story that was a multi-week story, and every week it would end on a cliffhanger. He was way ahead of his time. It was 150 years ago or something like that. Basically, the premise of the story was, what if there was a group of people who, before they made any big decision, asked the question, what would Jesus do? Now, obviously, the 1990s, we had the WWJD bracelet fad, and so it's so cheesy now. What would Jesus do? But at the time, that was like a groundbreaking concept that no one had really thought about. And pretty soon, young people started pouring into this pre-Netflix Sunday night church service to hear these epic stories. And there was a Christian magazine editor in Chicago who said, Sheldon, we love these stories. We'd love to publish it as a book. And so they did. It's called In His Steps, and it's a book about this group of people who always ask, what would Jesus do? But the publisher screwed up the copyright, and accidentally the book fell into the public domain. And over 30 different publishers stole Sheldon's copyright and just ripped it off and published their own versions of In His Steps. And the book became massive. Yeah, so all these publishers are stealing a book on what would Jesus do. Incredible.
Wow.
But yet God used it for good. And the book became one of the best-selling novels of all time. Tens of millions of copies sold. Hugely influential, and he got almost none of the credit and almost none of the cash, but he did not care. He continued to be a pastor. He published, I think, over 50 other books. He actually funded the first African-American kindergarten, I think, west of the Mississippi. And one of his students, who he later paid for to go to university, was one of the lawyers on the case of Brown versus Board of Education that desegregated American schools. So, Sheldon is influential in our lives to this day because of his faithfulness a century ago.
Amazing.
And he had a great beard.
Well, that's great. I really need to check this devotional out. You do a lot of writing. You've had your books endorsed by heads of state. You've been published in Time Magazine, Esquire, Guardian, many others. And you also have numerous articles on Medium. Now, there's a recent one that you had written that was probably the best post that I have read in all of 2020. It was called How to Take Back Control of Your Life from Addictive Internet Algorithms. Now, I'm going to read a little bit of what it says in here. You begin by saying, sadly for most of us, the internet has become a highly toxic, anxiety-inducing, privacy-eroding, sleep-robbing, work-distracting, ad-blitzing, time-devouring wormhole to nowhere. The fact is that we're simply no match for the addiction algorithms that now rule the web. We're too weak for the internet, or rather the internet is too strong for us. Is it possible to flip the switch? Is it possible to create a lifelong internet experience that's enjoyable, private, low anxiety, and time-controlled with zero ads and minimal tracking that actually contributes to your bottom line life goals? This step-by-step article will show you exactly how I did it. So I clicked into there and found some gold. I think everyone would like to be equipped to free themselves towards their bottom line life goals. So I've written down a few highlights from here, but can you give us a taste of some practical methods in this article of what you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I think probably the caveat before getting into any sort of conversation regarding technology is when Michelle and I went to Central America volunteering 10 years ago, I decided to put my BlackBerry, my hip holstered giant 2-pound BlackBerry, I decided to put my plan on hold and try to go half a year without a cell phone while we traveled through Central America. So I did, and we got home and I said, I don't want to reactivate yet, and I will get a phone when I feel I need one. And that was almost 10 years ago. And I have not had a Crackberry, a smartphone, or a cell phone since. And what's been interesting, Rob, is that as time has gone on, I feel like I took the road less traveled
Right.
and the paths are diverging greatly. And I've never seen porn on a cell phone. And it is not because I'm a hugely disciplined man. I have never seen porn on a cell phone because I do not own a cell phone. I cannot imagine if I had porn in my pocket 24 hours a day. It would be like giving a 10-year-old a pack of cigarettes and saying, don't smoke. I just cannot imagine it. I can't imagine the social media addiction I would have. I can't imagine the news and politics addiction I would have. I'd be checking constantly. I'd be getting pinged by emails and social media, and I just wouldn't have time to think. I wouldn't have time to read. I wouldn't have time to walk. My wife would never see me. I actually just can't fathom what that world would look like for me. So it's one of the best decisions I've ever made, for sure. It's just a big win. Put it in the win category and move on with your life.
Sorry to interrupt you here, but some people would say, I need to be successful at my work. I need to have my smartphone. I need to have this. But here you are, a guy who's produced all of these documentaries and written these books and getting all this information out on Medium, yet you're doing that without the aid of this technology that we're speaking of.
The argument that, I need my phone for work is a pretty weak argument, because it's like, okay, fine, get a work phone, leave it at work, right? If you're taking it home, it's called workaholism. Theoretically speaking, someone could have a work phone, and if they really needed to, they could have a home phone as well, right? They could have 2 cell phones if they really wanted to do that. But it doesn't matter. I'm not trying to convince anyone not to get a cell phone. Technology is a Pandora's box. Once the wheel was invented, we're not going back. Once fire was invented, we're not going back. Now that we have addiction devices in our pockets, we're not going back, right? Society marches forward. There's no point in trying to argue. My goal in life is not so much to change the world, but to make sure the world doesn't change me. James K.A. Smith says it so well. He says phones are formational devices. They are a bundle of liturgies. They are nudging us. My best friend always says, how many nudges until it's a shove? They are nudging us every single day to make decisions that we weren't going to make. So for instance, I have this one ad blocker on my computer. Not many people know about it. And in the last 2 years, it's blocked over 2.3 million advertisements. That's 2.3 million nudges that someone else said, I want to implant this idea in Jared's mind today. I want Jared to divert his attention to this product, this service, this idea, this whatever it is. And I don't want that. I want to have time to think. I want to have time to read and be with people, be present. It's really sad to go out for dinner with people and there's just so much distraction and you're not present in the moment with people. And the best thing we can give each other is presence. The number one thing correlated to human happiness is togetherness. And 2 people can be together and yet be worlds apart if they are on their screens. And that's not a bottom line value in my life.
And the number one thing for eradicating poverty is also togetherness, eliminating the separation. So in this article too, Jared, you mentioned social versus social plus media. You talk about time awareness apps, time defensive apps, ad defensive apps, anonymous browsing, going grayscale, no notifications, ditch Twitter because it's far too political and it's just a wormhole. I don't even want to get started on Twitter. But also Facebook news eradicator feed. Can you touch on a couple of those things that I think people would find quite interesting?
The best thing probably is to just read the article. All the links are in there and whatnot. You've got to be blocking all the ads out of your life, right? You can't allow a marketer to schedule a thought into your brain. You've got to get them out of your head. you've got to make the web less addictive. So your phone, if you're serious about beating addiction, has got to be grayscale. So when we were making our documentary on pornography, I interviewed this brain surgeon. They did this research project where they took birds and they switched out their own eggs for bedazzled, colorful, golden, shiny different eggs. They added them to the nest. Pretty soon the birds started ignoring their own eggs and cared for the shiny eggs. Wow. And the human brain is 100% wired for shiny, shiny, shiny. Yeah. So one of the ways you can do is just the very first thing you can do is just get rid of the color. That's a huge first step. Mm-hmm. You want time defensive apps that are going to protect your time. You need ad defensive apps. You need to be protecting yourself. A phone is an addiction device. What is a phone for? What is the purpose of a phone? The number one thing that phones do is serve ads, right? Tools use us. A hammer cannot hammer a nail without the use of a human, right? A car cannot drive itself without the use of a human. And a phone cannot deliver ads without a human using it. So ads are the number one reason that a phone exists from a financial perspective. Getting you to upgrade your phone every couple of years is another one. Selling you apps is another one. Obviously, you can use a phone as an amazing tool. I'm not saying that at all. I just haven't seen anyone do it, right? I just haven't seen anyone who's fully mastered their device and put it to use strictly and solely for the purposes of fulfilling their life calling. So that's really the encouragement. I'm not saying to anyone, ditch your phone. I'm really not. I'm just saying figure out a way to not let it hinder your calling, and good luck.
Well, it's an incredible article, and if people want to look it up, it's on medium.com, written by Jared A. Brock. Jared, you're doing incredible things in furthering this world to be more just and kind and humble, which is the meta-narrative of this entire podcast. And you're stewarding your own gifts well, and many are being blessed as a result. So what are some of the biggest challenges or hurdles that you're currently facing? And how could people best support you in overcoming them?
Wow, that's a very kind question. I think one of my big challenges is people who found my work have really connected with it. My first book of Year of Living Prayerfully came out, sold around 13,000 copies and had 140 plus 5-star reviews. And I got so many emails, just people raving about it. But it didn't really go anywhere. And that seems to have been a trend with my projects so far. I'm not a Kim Kardashian. I'm not a Donald Trump. I don't have this magical ability to hijack all media attention. Right. And it's also something I don't think is healthy for me as well. So I think if people want to engage with the things I've created and find them worthy to share with others, I think that would be the kindest thing for sure. It's just to share my work. What's interesting about being a writer and a filmmaker is you create, let's say, a book, and one person reads it, it's worth X, but it actually grows in value the more people read it. For years to come, can add more value to the world simply by having your work shared. So I would love my body of work to just become more valuable to more people. And that takes people they've read the book, share it with a friend, share a link, share a post, whatever it is. If it's helpful. If it's not helpful, ignore me forever, obviously.
I'm one of those people who your work has incredibly touched. And for people to find more about Jared's work, visit jaredabrock.com. That's JAREDA Brock.com. And you'll find just some gold in there and some very life-impacting topics and ways that you can actually participate and really turn things around for yourself and others. So Jared, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap things up?
I just think life is so short, and we've really just got to make it count for something eternal. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or an atheist, we're all going to die. The question is, what are we going to live for first? And so, I really want to make my days count. I've been bashing my head against income taxes for the last couple of days and just hating my life because of it. It's such a waste, such an unproductive thing to do. I want to have that intentionality my whole life of, did today count forever? I think maybe that's another theme in my work. It's just this urgency that now is the time.
Yeah, and I can see that. It's almost a subversive theme that we're to number our days now. Forever counts right now. Jared, I just want to thank you for not only just being a guest on this podcast to share, but for the work that you're doing. It's revolutionary. And it's funny to say that because you're bringing a lot of light into some very dark places and some places that I think people may not even realize that they're struggling in. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing in here and for joining us on the 6-8 Culture podcast. And we'd like to have you back again sometime as well. So thanks for being here with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We're all going to die. The question is, what are we going to live for now? Wise words from writer and director Jared Brock. For more information on Jared's work, visit jaredabrock.com. That's jaredabrock.com. Thanks for sharing your time with the 6-8 Culture podcast, where we share stories of personal transformation that are making our world a more just, kind, and humble place. Join us for our next session of impacting stories with 6-8 Culture. This is Rob McKinley signing out with a reminder for us all to act justly, to be kind, and to walk humbly.